Okay, good morning, everyone. Actually, I'm little worried for a few things in the sense that I thought probably when I make presentations, there'll be a lot of doubts and clarifications you guys will have, but since not many questions are coming up either, you guys are not finding the things very interesting, or maybe you feel that everything in the subject has been told, which is never true. Uh, but anyway, I encourage you to come forward with as many questions as you guys have, because question answer is the session which gives us the opportunity of interaction, and also make sure that we are able to follow the things the way we can, and we are trying to apply in the way that we would like to be. So I have a question from somebody about the difference between the active pharmaceutical ingredient and biomolecule. Who sent me that question? Uh, is the person here? I don't remember the name, but I got an email, so maybe I thought instead of replying him for the email, I will tell about that in the house, so that everybody knows about that. Maybe many of you might be knowing, but the difference between an active pharmaceutical ingredient and the active biomolecules or bioactive molecule is that all the APIs are bioactive molecules, but all the bioactive molecules are not APIs. Whenever we have any pharmaceutical preparation, uh, it has a certain one or more than one ingredients which are really pharmacologically active, but rest of the ingredients in the pharmaceutical preparations are there either to increase the bioavailability of the drug or solubility of the drug, or make it more bioavailable. Uh, Normally, those ingredients are not pharmacologically active, and more commonly known as expients. So that is the answer to that question. Maybe I would like to I can answer him separately also. But I just made a little change in the schedule. Uh, I thought uh, every day going through the basics only, intermittently we should try to go off the pathway and try to make sure that whatever we are learning on the basics, how we are able to apply them. So, and there was some kind of request for some group that since they are more interested in the neurosciences, so I thought uh, today's uh, lecture is going to be the application of phenotypic bioassays and bioefficacy models for neurodegenerative diseases and nerve injuries. Neuroscience is a very broad area. Neurological disorders and everything is a very broad area. So I just selected a very limited area so that we can keep our application and focus discussion focus more focused. So that's the reason I selected neurodegenerative diseases and nerve injuries, because this is one of the area in neurosciences which is medically there is an unmet need. There are no drugs, proper drugs for treatment of these diseases, and the research in this area is much more advanced compared to other fields. So that's the reason I thought I will be discussing that. Yesterday we discussed about the basic aspects of phenotypic screening. So some of them they will come up today, and we'll be able to see that how those phenotypic approaches we are able to apply. So neurodegenerative diseases, when we call it, this is a group of diseases, mainly Alzheimer's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Huntington disease, Parkinson's disease. These are the main neurodegenerative diseases. And why we call them neurodegenerative diseases, that particularly aging is the greatest risk factor for these most of these neurodegenerative diseases. mitochondrial DNA mutation as well as oxidative stress, late onset of meaning there is some factor that changes as a person ages. The etiology of all the four diseases and the mechanism of action or the target of actions or the genes or the targets which are involved in development of these diseases are different, but there is one thing which is common. The constant factor in all these diseases is that in each disease, the neurons gradually lose function as the disease progresses with the age. So that is the reason that we call them neurodegenerative disorders. Another, which is the related thing with the neurodegenerative disorder, is popularly known as neuronal injuries. Neuronal injuries, they are like nervous system injuries affecting 90,000 people every year. It's estimated that spinal cord injuries alone, they affect more than 10,000 people every year. And this is not the global data, this is the data mostly for the US situation. So I don't know, the global data for the incidences must be much more higher. And as a result of this high incidences of neurological injuries, nerve regeneration, the repair is becoming a rapidly growing field and dedicated to the discovery of new ways to recover the nerve function after the injury. So this is nerve injury can occur in different ways. So while the peripheral nervous system has the intrinsic ability to repair and regenerate, but the CNS system, for the most part, it was considered that it is incapable of self-repair and regeneration. And that is the reason that most of the neurodegenerative disease which affect the brain and the central nervous system, the reversal of those injuries has been considered as very difficult and challenging. So there is currently no treatment for recovering the human nerve functions after injury to the central nervous system. That is the reason most of the treatments which are available, they either partially reverse or protect, or their efficacies are not really certain. So the therapy in this area is very much based upon the individuals and certain other considerations. So the treatment for the Alzheimer's or the neurodegenerative diseases, there are available for some neurodegenerative diseases. With the majority of them, they control only the disease symptoms. It's not that they either reverse the disease or treat the disease or cure the disease, but majority of them, they only control the disease symptoms. These symptomatic control therapies, they usually work well in the early phase of the disease, when there is an onset of the disease in the early phase, but gradually they lose efficacy when the disease progresses with the significant loss of neuron or the neuron function. For example, one of the drug which is donepezil, it controls the dementia only after a short period of time in Alzheimer's disease patients. And sometimes even generate significant clinical side effects. For example, levodopa, it causes motor fluctuation and dyskinesia in moderate to advanced Parkinson's disease patients. So sometimes they are not really treating the patients, but they are creating more problems rather than giving the benefits. And as a result, the focus for drug discovery, for particularly for neurodegenerative diseases, has been shifted to the identification of the disease-modifying molecules, the molecules which are able to modify the disease and that delay or halt the disease progression and offer prolonged or sustained clinical benefits to the patient. So this is one of the approach and idea for discovery and development of new drugs for neurodegenerative disorders. The target-based drug discovery, particularly as I mentioned yesterday, for disease-modifying agents has been ongoing for many years. There were some ideas about some targets, but without much success, particularly due to incomplete understanding of the molecular mechanism underlying neurodegeneration. So this has been one of the challenge. Phenotypic screening, which starts with the disease relevant phenotypes to screen for compounds that change the outcome of biological pathway rather than activities as a certain specific target. This offers an alternative approach to find small molecules or the targets that modulate the key characteristics of neurodegeneration. This is the same thing I mentioned yesterday too, that for the phenotypic screening approach, you don't really need the exact idea about the target of action. You are interrogating the whole pathway. So the phenotypic screening that focuses on amelioration of disease-specific toxins or the protection of neurons from the degeneration or promotion of neuroregeneration, it could be a potential fertile ground for discovery and therapeutic agents for neurodegenerative diseases. This is the idea. There are three main areas which can focus, particularly when you are dealing regarding the phenotypic approaches for new drug discovery against the neurodegenerative diseases. So now there has been some increased knowledge on the molecular target, but it has not been translated into improved efficacy, particularly for discovering disease-modifying therapeutic agents for neurodegenerative diseases. It's even challenge whether there is some people try to question, that whether there is an over-reliance on the target-based approach for drug discovery, and has it really resulted in the success? Some people say no. It has rather resulted in a reduced success in discovering the first-in-class medicines. And some of the example I gave yesterday when I presented some data that how phenotypic screen-based drug discovery has been more successful in getting the drugs, particularly first-in-class drugs, in clinic rather than target-based drug discovery. So as an example, a number of disease-specific aggregated proteins were identified as the promising targets for neurodegeneration. But then the clinical trials of the therapeutic antibody, which was developed against this amyloid beta protein, which is one of the culprit, particularly in the Alzheimer's disease, the antibody really did not improve the cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease patients. Although did reduce the amount of amyloid beta plaque in the brain, but the cognitive function in AD patients was not really improved. So, if we are working on a target specifically, one of the most assumed idea, particularly for the Alzheimer's disease, is that the presence of plaques, particularly for amyloid beta protein aggregation, is one of the major culprit for producing the dementia in Alzheimer's disease. But this case study regarding the incomplete success or the incomplete efficacy of this antibody against this one, even though it is reducing the plaque, but it's not really improving the disease. So this is an idea that just hitting the target and working on the target may not be really enough. We need something more than that. There are some additional factors which are required, and fortunately, the approach for phenotypic drug discovery is able to take care of those additional factors too. So the consideration is that why this antibody fails to show an effect in the trials is a question with many possible answers. One of the possible answer may be that there is an insufficient target engagement, there is an improper timing of intervention, or even the irrelevance of amyloid beta as a therapeutic target. This may contribute to the failure. So most of the drugs which people had been working on for Alzheimer's disease, this has been one of the major targets where people have been working. But as I mentioned, that there are question marks that is it really the therapeutic target, or it is the only therapeutic target, or there are some collective pathways or more interactions are involved here. Just reducing the plaques or reducing the amyloid beta plaques may not be necessary for treatment of the Alzheimer's disease. So unfortunately, for most of the neurodegenerative diseases, the pathogenesis is complicated. The mechanisms which underlie the pathogenesis of the disease are not very clear. This has resulted in a kind of general lack of well-validated targets for disease modification. Even though amyloid beta protein has been one of the validated important target. Furthermore, modulating a single gene target may not always tune this cellular network for beneficial outcome. As I mentioned that there might be multiple factors involved in there. So hitting a single target may not be really good approach. So as such, the target-based approach may not provide sufficient therapeutic impact, especially for the neurodegenerative diseases, which are where the complex mechanisms are playing the role. So with phenotypic screening, there are hopes to discover new therapeutic targets, new disease biology, and at the same time, new drugs for the neurodegenerative disease. So with this preamble, we will try to progress further on screening against the phenotypes that recapitulate the key pathology of neurodegenerative diseases. So phenotypic assays are designed based on disease-relevant phenotypes. In neurodegenerative diseases, the driver phenotype, but the main phenotype is there is a progressive loss, death, or dysfunction of neurons, which eventually cause the symptoms in the patient. So we know that is one thing for sure occurring in all the neurodegenerative disorders. So for example, in Parkinson's disease, this is characterized by progressive degeneration of dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. The loss of dopaminergic neurons results in the diminished dopaminergic stimulation in the stratum, which eventually causes motor dysfunction. So this is one of the factors which we know for sure. Therefore, agents which can ameliorate or attenuate the degeneration of neurons are actively searched for to modify disease progression and provide the clinical benefit. So that is the approach. So the phenotypic screening for new discovery for epilepsy gives us one of the success story here, that how phenotypic screening can really produce some good results, and there are some cases, particularly in the case of new drug discovery for epilepsy. So the successful case is from the epilepsy field, where phenotypic screening has contributed to the boom of anti-epilepsy drugs since 1980s. So owing to National Institute of Health sponsored, there was a anti-convulsant drug screening program which was initiated by NIH. Thousands of new chemical entities from academic as well as pharmaceutical companies, they were screened in various rodent models for activity against the seizures. So phenotypic screening involves both in vitro as well as in vivo also. So in this case, it was screened in the rodent models, and this collaboration between the NIH and the anti-convulsant drug discovery program and between the academic and pharmaceutical company resulted in a discovery of and development of battery of drugs for epilepsy. These are some of the drugs which are resulted, and now the choice of drugs available for treatment of epilepsy is there. You can have successful drugs for the treatment, and this is one of the story which can be translated into another areas too. So when it comes to phenotypic strategy for drug screening for neurodegenerative diseases, as I mentioned, the progressive loss of the neuron is one of the factors which is for sure, and there is a level up to which it can be reversible, but once the function is completely lost and it's a dead neuron, it's not reversible. So there is up to a certain level you can reverse this function, and there are three different stages of the loss of the neural function. Initially, there is generation or the production or the appearance or the interaction of some toxic molecules which are present. There can be different kind of toxins which, when interact with the neurons, they cause some progressive loss. These can be aggregative proteins, oxidative stress, or some other functions. So initial idea is that if you can reduce or the control this loss at the level of this, you will have to have some kind of strategy for removal of the toxin. Either the toxin should not be produced, or if it is being produced, you are able to remove it before it is able to cause the damage to the neurons. Then, of course, some of the factors you may not be able to control because they are generated in situ, particularly because of the metabolic reactions, because of the physiological reactions, because of the normal physiology of the systems. There are certain factors, they affect the neuron functions and cause the neuron damage. So if you have a strategy which is called neuroprotection, so if you are able to generate some agents which uh, protect the neurons from those stresses for the loss, then the second strategy which can be used is that development of strategy for neuroprotection. But still, if you have the damage of the neuron, then there are some ideas now. Previously, it was thought that in adult brain there cannot be neuroregeneration, but now there are reports that there are certain sites in the brain still the neurogenesis still occurs in the adult brain. So the third aspect which you can target for phenotypic drug discovery is the regeneration of the neuron. Regeneration of the neuron or the generation of new neurons from the original stem cells. So these are the three. So I will discuss the idea of phenotypic screening and the approach of phenotypic screening and the models which are available for screening the compounds at all three stages. So first comes how the approach of toxin removal can be used for screening the compound and development of the model. The first approach, which focuses on the toxin removal or the toxin reduction, it aims to eliminate the toxin or stress which causes the neurodegeneration. So that is the approach. So the main assumption here is that by reducing the toxin or the stress level in the cell or in the environment that affects the neuron, will be able to self-recover and regain the functions, whereas the affected neurons will remain intact. So it's a kind of neuroprotection only, but the approach is different. So therefore, the reduction of toxin level will be the primary endpoint for phenotypic based screen. So if you are trying to develop this kind of a molecule or identify the molecules which remove the toxin or reduce the toxin, the reduction of the toxin level will be the primary endpoint here. The human genetics, disease pathogenesis, and the advancement of molecular biology, they have suggested several candidates that may cause the neurodegeneration in the patients. So we know some of the previous study that what are the factors involved in there. So based on these candidate toxicants, the phenotypic assays they have been designed, the chemical screens have been carried out for the compounds that could reduce the level of these toxins. So I will give you some of the examples, particularly for the toxin removal. In Huntington disease, for example, it's known to be caused by autosomal dominant mutation of the gene HTT. This is characterized by expansion of CAG triplet repeats, which results in the formation of polyglutamine residues, or most popularly known as polyQ, in one of the places which is exon 1 of the HTT gene. So the mutant HTT exerts a selective toxicity for striatal medium spiny neurons, and although the mechanism is still very unclear, but we know that these polyglutamine residues are the important culprits in this case. So the HTT with long polyQ expansion is prone to aggregation. This gene with the long polyglutamine residue, it has the property for the aggregation. and intranuclear inclusions of the mutant HTT in neurons are pathological hallmarks of Huntington disease. So based on this phenotype, there is a high throughput assay was designed to quantify the intracellular HTT aggregates in one of the cell line, PC12 cells. I will explain about what are these cells. One of my in some part of my presentation in the later slides, what are these PC12 cells which express this mutation. So a library collection of more than 200,000 compounds they were successfully screened with a good assay quality. But intriguingly, HIT exerted differential regulation of HTT aggregation and the cell viability. So some of the hits they reduce the aggregation level, they reduce the toxicity induced by polyglutamine reduced in the neuron cells, but other they improve the cell viability, but further enhance the HTT aggregation. So this question whether the HTT aggregates are really the cause of neuronal death, which is healthy, which is heatedly debate within the community. So even though this assay was developed, but the aggregation of the HTT function is really the question of debate here. Then second case here is in case of Alzheimer's disease, it displays the prominent pathological hallmarks of extracellular amyloid plaque, which is composed of amyloid beta peptide, which I mentioned, and intracellular neurofibrillary tangles composed of hyper phosphorylated tau protein. This tau protein, when it is hyperphosphorylated, it accumulates in the Alzheimer's disease, and also the amyloid beta peptide plaques are one of the factors here. So with the assumption that these disease hallmarks they are associated with the disease progression, some phenotypic screens they were developed and carried out looking for the compounds which either reduce the amyloid beta level or they reduce the tau levels in the brain. So a human cell line which secretes the amyloid beta, it was used for screening. The secreted amyloid beta peptide, 40 and 42 peptides, they were measured by ELISA, and among 2,160 compounds, 7 were confirmed to reduce the amyloid beta levels. Then another effort in one of the neuroblastoma cells expressing high endogenous tau, they were used to screen the natural product that reduced the tau protein level in this one. Bayberry extract, it was identified as a potent tau reducer, and a finding further confirmed in mouse fresh forebrain tissue slices. So this is the approach by which you can identify the compound which reduce the amyloid beta levels, you can identify the compounds which reduce the tau levels, you can identify the compounds which affect the accumulation of polyglutamine aggregates in Huntington disease. So the assays are very simple, they are very robust, even though since they are phenotypic assays, they are not as high throughput as the target based assays, but still you can screen thousands of compounds through these phenotypic assays. Then another thing here is, particularly in this area only, the toxin removal. The Parkinson disease is characterized by a key pathology of intracellular factor, where the protein alpha synuclein, when it accumulates, it causes the accumulation of the bodies, which are commonly known as Lewy bodies. So although the function of this protein in neuron has not been fully elucidated, there are several lines of evidences which suggest that alpha-synuclein accumulation induces the dysfunction of neuron. So with this one, there was a high throughput screening phenotype screening model was developed. More than 300,000 compounds were screened for the inhibition of alpha-synuclein translation in one of the cell line, engineered cell line, which is H4 cell, which was conducted. One compound was confirmed to reduce the alpha-synuclein translation with more than 200-fold selectivity over the prion protein. So it was a selectivity, this compound was selectively reducing the level of this particular protein. Interestingly, when then they did structure activity relationship study around this compound, it suggested that certain structural features uh, for maintaining this efficacy. So they know the lead compound now, and probably they will be able to put it more in more advanced preclinical studies. So the lead compound is under further evaluation in primary dopaminergic neurons and is the and in the animal model for Parkinson's disease. I'm just trying to give you the idea that how different approaches is leading to development of lead molecules, particularly for more advancement. Further going on the same approach of toxin removal, we know that the oxidative stress is one of the metabolic load of neurons with long axons and rapid neural transmitter release. When the neurotransmitters they release, one of the things is that they are detoxified or deaminated with the help of the enzyme called monoamine oxidase. And monoamine oxidase function causes release of lot of oxidative stress. The excessive oxidative stress disrupts the protein, DNA, lipids, and the intracellular organelles, which ultimately leads to cell death. So even though this factor is not very selective and specific, but we know that the large generation of oxidative stress is also one of the culprits, particularly for death, loss, or damage of the neurons. In neurodegenerative diseases, oxidative damage such as production of oxidized nucleotides, oxidized proteins, they have been observed in the dying neurons as an early event. So this is a kind of early marker when you see the accumulation of oxidized nucleotides or oxidized proteins in these neurons, you feel like that these are a kind of early biomarkers which probably may lead to damage or death of the neurons or affect the neuron functions. So to identify the compounds with antioxidant properties, the phenotypic screen measuring the intracellular oxidative stress was conducted. In particular, one of the cell line, which is NSC34 motor neuron cells, what they did is that they did this assay under the process of serum withdrawal. So when you withdraw the serum, the cells are more prone to oxidative stress. So when you are trying to see produce the conditions of more prone for oxidative stress, your assay will be more robust and more selective. They were able to obtain some hits, which they further tested in NSC34 cells, which overexpress the mutant superoxide dismutase in a cell-based model, particularly for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Interestingly, some but not all the hit compounds, they reduce the oxidative stress induced by mutant SOD, and they improve the cell viability. So this was one of the improvement in the sense that even though in the whole cell assay they show antioxidant property, but there are only some which are able to protect the cells from the oxidative stress in presence of this mutant superoxide dismutase, and particularly improve the cell viability. These compounds, they have been further shown to protect the primary motor neurons against the trophic factor and the withdrawal induced stress. So there is a pathway through which you try to progress your lead compound, but I am just trying to give you an idea about approach for new drug discovery. Again, continuing on this one, we know that there are a lot of extrinsic factors also, they also contribute to neuronal death. And in the disease conditions, neuroinflammation characterized by activation of glial cells, some interaction of some of the peripheral lymphocytes with the neurons, which infiltrate in the area and increase pro-inflammatory, the production of generation of the increased pro-inflammatory cytokine levels. It also plays a detrimental role on the neurons. And these also might be some of the factors which may lead to neuron death and the neuron function. So when they use a microglia-like cell line, which is BV2, some of the fluorovinyl oxyacetamide derivatives, with anti-inflammatory properties were screened against the LPS-induced nitric oxide production in these cells. The hit compounds, they also reduced the LPS-induced production of tumor necrosis factor, which is one of the cytokines, and interleukin 1 beta, and they protected the neuroblastoma cells against the microglia activation induced toxicity. This was the approach which you can use, how you can protect the cells from the damage caused by some of the extrinsic factors. So moving on from that first level of phenotypic screen, the second level of drug discovery approach is identification of the agents which generate neuroprotection. So neuroprotection means when the patients of a neurodegenerative disease, they manifest the clinical symptoms, there has already been chronic accumulation of toxins. So when you start seeing the symptoms, those culprit toxic factors or the toxins, they have already accumulated in sufficient quantities, and there is a significant amount of neurons they have already started to degenerate. So at this stage, just the removal of toxin may not be sufficient and may be little late to attenuate or ameliorate this situation. So the approach might be that neuroprotection contributes another important strategy to preserve the remaining function neurons in a maximal way and slow the disease progression. So the most common model used for screening, which includes the aggregated protein-induced cytotoxicity, is known that amyloid beta in Alzheimer's disease, synuclein in the Parkinson disease, they are the one they cause the neuronal injuries. So the protecting the neuronal cells from these culprits is an approach for neuroprotection. And oxidative induced cytotoxicity, which includes the mitochondrial dysfunction and inflammation induced cytotoxicity, are also there. So there is some level of commonality between this approach, the latter this approach, and the approach which is used for the toxin removal. So there is a kind of little overlapping between the idea of toxin removal and producing the idea of generating the agents which are known as neuroprotective agents. So the end point in these assays primarily is the protection of cell death by test compounds rather than modulating of the level of toxic species. So in earlier assay, you are trying to see whether the test compound is decreasing the level of toxins, decreasing level of those factors which are producing the cell death. In this case, your approach is not to see whether your compounds or the lead or hits are decreasing the level of toxins or not, but are they really protecting the cells? So maybe this protection might be either both way. Either they are neutralizing the functions of toxins or they are reducing the levels of toxins. So that's the reason I told that there is some level of overlapping in this when we go to toxin removal. But the end point for assay is different compared to what I mentioned in case of earlier approach. So in one of the cellular model for Alzheimer's disease, the extracellular amyloid beta, it was used as an insult to induce the cell death. In this model, this particular group I mentioned about, they screen 120,000 compounds, which includes the compound approved by FDA, compound purified from natural product libraries, and the compounds purchased from the diverse libraries. They were screened using calpain production as an early readout for the cell death. It's like these factors are inducing some level of apoptosis in these. All the hits, they were identified, they blocked the calpain production and the cell death with no direct inhibition of calpain enzyme activity. So in another assay for Parkinson disease, the neuroblastoma cell were transfected with one of the mutant synuclein human gene and treated with the methylphenylpyrimidine, which is one of the factor which induces the cell death, and exogenous dopamine to induce the cytotoxicity, and measured by diphenyl tetrazoline bromide assay. So this is one of the assay by which you just try to see the prevention or the protection of cell death caused by these toxins. Then there was another model system for evaluation of the toxicity of aggregated protein is in the yeast. This is one of the simple model which I developed. In this one, the toxicity can be conveniently observed by the change in the cell growth measured by colony size. So what they did is that they overexpressed the alpha-succinylene gene in the yeast, and the treatment with the ferric chloride treatment induces the death. So more than 10,000 compounds they were purchased from one of the agencies, and the sigma Aldrich, they were screened against this. The compound heterogeneous model, but an indirect model to check whether the cell death caused by alpha-synuclein and ferric chloride can be reversed by these antioxidative agents or not. The protective effect of galactocatechin gallate was further confirmed in MPTP induced mouse model. So this was one of the progress from the in vitro to in vivo, where they were able to show that one of the lead compound which is showing protection in vitro model is also showing activity in vivo in terms of protection. So then there is another yeast model with a high level of expression of alpha-synuclein was used for screening, and overexpression of alpha-synuclein generated significant toxic effect on the mitochondrial function. So using cell growth, mitochondrial function recovery, and alpha-synuclein aggregation load as the readouts. So they use three factors as the readouts. More than 100,000 compounds they were screened, which compose of these libraries, and hits were subsequently confirmed to reduce the alpha-synuclein induced toxicity in nematode and primary red dopaminergic neurons. So once they identify the lead from this, when they advance these to subsequent models where C. elegans nematode and the red dopaminergic neurons they were tested, they were able to see that whatever lead they identified from there, they were showing some protection in vivo conditions too. So further going on this neuroprotection area, beside neuronal survival, promoting the neurite outgrowth or the neurite growth against the insult, it has also been considered as a viable surrogate, particularly in the phenotypic screening for assessing the neuronal functions. If your neuron is going properly, if your neurite outgrowth is happening, it means the agents which you are screening, they are giving you some level of protection against the cell death here and neuroprotection. So in one of the study, mouse cerebellar granule neurons, they were used to screen the compounds that promote the neurite outgrowth in the presence of inhibitory myelin substrate. 4 hits from the newly synthesized compound library were identified, and which prevented the inhibitory effect of myelin. One of the hit was subsequently confirmed in a variety of neurite outgrowth assays. This assay I will be describing in much more detail when I explain the process of neuroregeneration. These compounds, they demonstrated the efficacy in vivo assays with sensory neuron dorsal column transaction and optical nerve crush. So what I am trying to mention is that the lead which are being identified and the hits which are being identified, they are being confirmed under the in vivo models too. Then in another recent report, the human-induced pluripotent stem cells, they derived neurons, they were treated with the extracellular amyloid beta 42, and the cell viability was measured as the primary endpoint. So instead of using the neuroblastoma cell line, instead of using primary cell line, here the cell line which was used was the neuronal cell line. So the neurons derived from iPSC stem cells. So the primary endpoint was neuritic outgrowth, and also quantified to confirm the screening results. There were several hundred compounds they were screened. 19 hits were identified, and what was found is that one of them was CDK2 inhibitor. So it's indirectly giving some kind of idea about the target too, but instead of using the primary neurons or the neuroblastoma cell line, you can use the stem cells also for this particular kind of screening. So the neuroinflammation, which as I discussed in the toxin removal section, also plays a significant role in the propagation of injury to neurons. So reducing neuroinflammation induced neuronal death is therefore also considered as another means of obtaining neuroprotection. So there was a mixed cell culture which was composed of mouse stem cell derived HP9 plus GFP protein level motor neurons and the mouse stem cell derived astrocytes and mouse microglia cells. Microglia cells are the one which are producing the inflammatory factions. They were treated with the LPS to produce the inflammation and production of interferon gamma, and this treatment induced BB2 cells to produce massive levels of nitric oxide, which then kill the motor neurons in the culture. So this model can also be used for screening, particularly for neuroprotection. Then there are some high content image analysis based on GFP expression, green fluorescent protein expression in the motor neurons. They were used to quantify the neuronal morphological changes and survival. More than 10,000 compounds derived from several different libraries containing known drugs or the novel chemical entities structurally enriched the various target groups. The hit compounds, they displayed diverse mechanisms to reduce the neuronal death, including inhibition of nitric oxide production by microglia, activation of NRF2 pathways in both microglia and astrocytes, and direct protection against the nitric oxide induced toxicity in motor neurons. So what I say is that neurotropic factors, they are protective. Sometimes neurons also produce some factors which are more commonly known as neurotropic factors. What are those neurotropic factors? I will be explaining in more detail when I go to the section on neuroregeneration, where I will be giving you some more detailed case studies. But what it is known that these neurotropic factors, they are also neuroprotective. They also give some protective molecules to support neuronal survival, and neurotropic factors deprivation. The deprivation of these neurotropic factors is considered as one of the mechanism for neurodegeneration. So small molecules with neurotropin-like activity, the molecules which act like neurotropins, they also would be good neuroprotective agents for neurodegenerative diseases. Some of these models I will be explaining the later half. So one such successful phenotypic screen was performed using primary midbrain dopaminergic neurons. Some phenolene-derived compounds were screened for hit supporting neuronal survival against the spontaneous degeneration, and by measuring the tyrosine hydroxylase immunoactivity and dopamine uptake. Several hit compounds they were identified, and they were shown to protect the cell from MPP induced toxicity, and they promoted the neurite outgrowth. So if any compound acting like a neurotropic agent can be a neuroprotective agent also. In addition, the neurotropin like molecules, the compound that induce the expression of neurotropins. It's not that compound itself might have the property like a neurotropin, or the compound might produce or induce the production or generation of neurotropin can also enhance the neuronal survival, and this will be of particular interest. So information of such kind of phenotypic scheme is yet to come. People are still working on that, whether any compound libraries or any hits which induce the production of neurotropins can also be neuroprotective also or not. We are also working in our lab on some of these assays. So here a cell-based assay may not be sufficient to represent all the aspects of the disease, ex vivo or in vivo animal models. So the ex vivo and in vivo animal models have been attempted for screening despite of very limited throughput capacity. So for example, compared with the cell-based models, organotypic culture offers a much more real life-like environment, studying the interaction of different cell types, including neurons, astrocytes, microglia, oligodendrites, and other cells. So one of the things is that people have also used the 3D cell cultures for screening in this case, including multiple kind of cell interaction studies. Several compounds have been reported to have effects in the promoting remyelination uh, and then in the brain. And these cultures now serve as mostly as a system for secondary assay to confirm hits from the primary assay. Now, despite of using all these cell-based assays, high-throughput assays, if we have a selected small set of compounds, then the animal models can be further choice for phenotypic screening, in which the compounds can be tested for effect on functional recovery and the behavioral outcome. As expected, the throughput of animal screen is very low. It's only so only a few successful cases they have been reported. For example, in one of the model where C. elegans, which is the small nematode, which has the GFP labeled dopaminergic neurons, uh, when they were treated with MPP to reduce the locomotor activity and dopaminergic neuron specific GFP intensity, this model was used for screening. Several active compounds were shown to be protective to the neurons in this model. Now, another model which has been used is the zebrafish, which is a small vertebrate. It's also used as a model for Parkinson's disease, in which both MPTP and MPP can specifically induce the loss of dopaminergic neurons and monoamine oxidase B inhibitor. In this model, one of the MAO-B inhibitor was shown to protect neurons from the cell death and being considered as one of the good lead model for further follow-up. Now, the next phenotypic level in this one is going to be uh, regeneration process, neuro regeneration. It's quarter to 11. So maybe I don't know if you want, we can stop here and then start after maybe half an hour, 11:15. We will be taking up. This is going to be a little longer section because I will be presenting some of the real data where we had been working in our lab on some of the approaches where you can identify the agents which can induce the neuro regeneration, particularly the neuroid outgrowth, and how these models have been useful. And we will also be discussing about the challenges which these models and different level of phenotypic screening have faced, and also the future prospects in this area. Thank you very much. So if you have any question from this section, you can ask it now or write it down. Feel free. Actually, this is one of the things which I was expecting, and I would like to be that I want these sessions to be as much interactive as possible. So don't feel shy. Come up with something. Even if you feel that your question is going to be very simple, it's like it's like a saying is that if you don't ask, you are fool forever, and if you don't ask, you are just fool for now, but will be intelligent for future. So please feel free, and then be as open as possible. Thank you. So welcome back. It's too loud. Welcome back. Actually, initially I planned to pause at once going through this the phenotypic screen for regeneration, but since we already took quite a good amount of time in initial two phenotypic screen, so now we have much more to cover in this 1 hour, or maybe it might go a little longer. So please excuse me, we have a lot of to cover in this section. I'm going to show you some of the real data generated out of those screens. So now we are at the third aspect of phenotypic screen for looking for the compounds which are beneficial for treatment of neurodegenerative disorders. And this level is looking for the molecules which work at the level of regeneration of the neurons, and how we will be able to find those molecules, what are the assays I'm going to describe. But before I go to that, just some kind of brief overview about what neuroregeneration is. That basically, earlier, as I mentioned, that there was a concept that in adult brain the neurons cannot be regenerated. It's a kind of once the neurons are damaged, it's an irreversible process. But now reports are appearing which have shown that there are certain areas in the brain which still have the capability to regenerate the neurons or produce some new neurons, so that the repair in the adult brain can also be induced in that way. The neurotropic action and the neuroprotection which leads to neuroplasticity and neurite art growth, these are the important markers for neuroregeneration, which I am going to discuss. Particularly the neuroregeneration, especially when I say adult neurogenesis, this implies that new neurons generated either through the proliferation of endogenous progenitor cells, particularly or by administration of exogenous precursor cells, which substitute the loss of the damaged neurons. So these two approaches can be there. Then reconstruction of the neuronal and the synaptic network in the injured brain is necessary for recovery of brain function. So this is the function which we have to really achieve, that the neural function and the neuroplasticity and the synaptic network, it has to be reconstructed, particularly in the injured brain, and this is important for recovery of brain function. As I mentioned, it was once believed that nerve regeneration in the mammalian central nervous system was irreversible, but recently it has become apparent that damaged neurons do regenerate in an active process, particularly under the presence of some stimulatory substances, and these stimulatory substances are known as neurotropins. I mentioned also before that also. So promoting the regeneration as a way to repair damaged neuronal tissue is an inspirational goal for treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. This is an important and inspirational goal. Two major approaches for regeneration, they have been studied. The first approach is to focus on transplantation of stem cells into the brain to repair damaged neural network, which is very difficult process. And the second approach emphasizes promoting neurogenesis. That is the approach we are more interested into. That is differentiation of resident neuronal stem cells and adult neural stem cell niches into new neurons, which may migrate to the site of damage site, and they are incorporated to the neuronal network. So this is the area we are more interested into. Phenotypic assays based on latter approach, they have been designed and applied to chemical screening. Beside neurogenesis, another process which is also can be used, where most of the damage in the neuron occurs because of the damage in the myelin membrane, and so neurogenesis as well as remyelination is the another important approach for promoting the neuronal regeneration. So when we say neuritogenesis is a key cellular process which is necessary for proper development of the adult nervous system and neuronal regeneration. The neurite extension from the same stroma depends on the precise cytoskeletal and the adhesion dynamics induced by sensing of extracellular signal. There are some extracellular signals which are necessary for inducing the neuritogenesis, and In a simple way, this process is similar to directional pseudopedal formation involving regulated actin-mediated membrane production and signal transduction processes. So the critical for this neuronal development, formation, and remodeling of synapses is the response to injury and regeneration. So with this one, this is the progression of the neuritic outgrowth in the neuratogenesis. And this gives you some kind of reflection for the neuronal differentiation and neuroregeneration. There is a stage one is the laminopodia, which is converted into immature neurites, and further growth gives rise to formation of axon, single axon. Then you see the formation of dendrites and further maturation of the neuron. And all these stages can be successfully monitored in vitro phenotypic assay systems in a very robust manner, in a very selective manner. The molecular signals for neuritic outgrowth and differentiation, there are complex signaling pathway involved in there. This is a very complex process. This requires the interplay of many signaling events, but the most important part is that this is initiated by the molecules which are commonly known as neurotropins. So currently there are different kind of indigenous neurotropins which are produced in the body. It may be a nerve growth factor, it may be a brain derived growth factor, neurotropin 3, neurotropin 4 or 5, depending upon the structure of these and the mode of action they follow and the pathway of signal stimulation of signal transduction pathway they follow. They have been put together in different categories. There are certain neurotropin receptors which are important for initiating these signals, particularly when it comes to nerve growth factor. There is a TRKA receptor which is involved. For BDNF and NT4 and 5, it's a TRKB receptor which is involved, while for NT3 effectors, both TRKB and TRKC might be involved. And how these play some roles, I will be presenting in a more simplified manner in the later part of my talk. But the most important neurotropin and the most common neurotropin is the nerve growth factor. This is 118 amino acid residue polypeptide, which is present as a functional dimer, and this plays an important role in the survival and development of certain neuronal population. This is a secreted protein that is important for the growth and maintenance and survival of certain target neurons and function as a signaling molecule. And this was one of the prototype growth factor, one of the early growth factors which were identified in the system. NTF is one of them. It's a prototype growth factor that is one of the first to be described. As I mentioned that nerve growth factor exerts its effect through a cascade of signaling pathway. What are those signaling pathways? We have interrogated some of these pathways. I will be telling you in more detail in the later part. But the model system which we use, mostly we use in our lab, is a cell line called PC12 cell. It's a model cell line for neuratogenesis, neuroregeneration, and neurosecretion. This is an adrenal pherocytochroma PC12 cell line. This was originally isolated from a tumor in the adrenal medulla of the rat. Like adrenal chromophil cells, the PC12 cells, they synthesize and accumulate the dopamine and sometimes noradrenaline too. These cells, they resemble the phenotype of a synaptic ganglion when they are exposed to nerve growth factor. They become a neuronal-like cell. The PC12 cells, they stop dividing and terminally differentiate when they are treated with the nerve growth factor. This is an important factor which really helps you to develop state. And this is one of the reasons that these PC12 cells, they are as a very useful model system for neuronal differentiation. So with this one of the cell line which we use in our lab, it's a clone of PC12 cell lab, is commercially available and more popularly is known as Neurosecreen 1. Neuroscreen 1 is just a PC12 cell line, but it's a clone which has been isolated from PC12 cell cultures, and it has been optimized for response to NGF stimulation for the neurite outgrowth. There are some advantages for using NS1 cell line rather than normal PC12 cell line. I will be showing you some of the data later. I hope this video works. No. Video चल सकता है क्या? They are put into the culture, and then when they are exposed to Norgood factor, how you see the formation of neurites, how you see the formation of neural branches, and that is the way you are able to measure the growth of the neurites in vitro. So this is one of the assay, in vitro assay, which we developed at our lab. This is the same assay. In a single assay, you can do two endpoints, You can also measure the cytotoxicity of the compound, and you also can measure the neurotropic activity of the compounds in the same go and the same way. Particularly, the cell culture is the NS1 cell culture. They are grown in RPMI medium. For cytotoxicity and neuritogenesis assay, there are 2,000 cells. They are plated per well. They are seeded onto collagen coated 96 well plate. But at present, now we have adopted this assay to 384 well plate also. They are incubated for 24 hours at 37. The culture's medium is replaced with a fresh medium with the nerve growth factor and or the test compound. The main thing is that test compounds are tested alone and also in presence of the NGF. So that way you are able to measure three activities. One, whether the compound itself has any neuritogenetic activity or not. Two, whether compound is having any inducible effect on the action of nerve growth factor or not, or sometimes there are some compounds, they might be inhibiting the neurotropic activity of NGF. So all these three kind of activities can be determined in one assay. For cytotoxicity, in the same plate, LMR blue is added, and after 72 hours, the plates are incubated for overnight, and the fluorescence is measured for the cytotoxicity. And because LMR blue is a non-cytotoxic dye, it will not affect the viability of the cells. So you can further carry over them. It will not affect the morphology of the cells. The same plate, the cells are washed with the PBS, and they are fixed and stained with GIMSA. Actually, there are automated assays available for neuritic growth, but we wanted to develop some assay which any lab with the limited resources can use. So that's the reason we use the simple stain, which is commonly used GIMSA stain. They were washed and completely dried, and these plates are subjected to digital imaging under a microscope. So this is the way, this is the simple way. You can see it's a 96 well plate. You can collect all the images of the cells present in these wells, and if you expose this one of the well, you see all these cells with the neurites, and these neurites can be quantitatively measured. There are different parameters which go. One of the software which is used for quantification of these neurons is NIS Element software, which is an ImageJ based available software. ImageJ is available publicly, so it can be obtained from any website. So this was used for the measurement and analysis of the neurite outgrowth and neuritogenesis. This is one of the simple picture, but when you amplify this, you see this cell with a small neuron. So this is the control cell, which you don't see much neuritic outgrowth. Once they are exposed to nerve growth factor, you see an extensive network of neurites which are generated, and with the tracing of these neurons, you can measure the length of these neurons. You can see the number of neurons. So there are 4 measurable parameters which you get from this. One is what is the mean neurite length. The mean neurite length is calculated as the ratio of total neurites length and the number of neurites. Then you also get another parameter which is called number of neurites per cell. This ratio between number of neurites and the and the number of cells which are counted. The third parameter which you get is the neurite length per cell, which is the ratio of the total neurite length and the number of cells counted. And fourth parameter which you get is that how branching of the neuron is about nodes per neurite measure the branching of the neuron. So whenever you are testing any compound, you are able to measure these four parameters in terms of neuritogenesis. This is one of the representative picture where we use PC12 cells. They were exposed to different concentrations of nerve growth factor, and we were able to generate some kind of standard graph. Sorry, the response is dose dependent. But if you look at the concentration of NGF, which is used here, starting from 25 nanogram to 200 nanogram. But when we compared this with the NERNES1 cell, which is the clone of PC12 cells, the concentration of as low as 1.25 nanogram per ml of NGF is able to produce appreciable neurite growth here, and the response of cell is much more better. The homogeneity of the cell is much more better compared to PC12 cells, and that is the reason this cell line is comparatively much better cell line compared to the parental PC12 cell line. And most of the assay which we do in our lab now based on this PC12 cell line only. So this was the part I was planning to start from here. So I'm going to give you some kind of case studies for application of these phenotypic screening for selected set of compounds as potential neurotropic agents. So the first set of compounds which we tested in our lab, this is just an example, give you an idea that how compound libraries are screened. This can be applied to any kind of compounds for screening. So we tested inhibitors of histone deacetylase as potential neurotropic agent. Why HDAC inhibitors? Because histone deacetylase is the enzyme which in combination with histone acetyl transferases is responsible for transcription regulation. It converts the relaxed chromatin into condensed chromatin and causes the transcription repression. So HDAC inhibitors are very important. There are different several isoforms of HDAC which have been reported. They have been classified into different classes based on their localization within the cell, based on their sequence similarity. The class 1, 2A, 2B, and 4, they are zinc dependent HDAC, and the class 3 NAD dependent, they are mostly known as sirtuins. So what we are mostly interested in these zinc dependent HDAC inhibitors which have been implicated into cancer. So why HDAC inhibitors we wanted to go through, in the sense that we know that the natural neurotropic agents, there are limitations. They have poor plasma stability and they are restricted to penetration to nervous system. And that's the reason that the natural neurotropins cannot be used as therapeutic agents. Now alternate is identification of low molecular weight compounds that can mimic the function of neurotropic factors and substitute for their clinical use. There had been some previous reports regarding role of HDAC inhibitors in neuronal differentiation. One of the things is that recently some of the HDAC inhibitors, they have been approved for the clinical use for some of the cancers. Another advantage here was availability of a battery of PAN as well as isoform selective HDAC inhibitors. There are some HDAC inhibitors which will inhibit all kind of HDAC irrespective of isoforms, and there are some inhibitors which will act on certain kind of isoforms. So you have the choice and selectivity for both of them. This is one of the diagram which shows that how HDAC inhibitors, they might be important for the neuronal differentiation. The HDACs inside the nucleus, they are responsible for repression of the transcription repression, and this transcription repression affects the production of increases the because of the transcription repression, this production of BDNF, GDNF can be decreased, which is increased because of the activation here. Another thing is that they also have some kind of cytosolic. There are some HDAC isoforms. They are responsible for acetylation of the tubulin, and the tubulin acetylation affects the. It is known that acetylation of tubulin affects the neuronal survival and has some kind of neuroprotective effect in neurons. So that's the reason that we just wanted to go for check of the HDAC inhibitors. These are select set of inhibitors we tested initially: trichostatin A, varinostat, these are the two pan-HDAC inhibitors, belinostat and tubistatin. They are the selective inhibitors. The tubistatin works on HDAC8, PCI works on HDAC6, and the 10ON is the serotonin inhibitor. But I am going to present you some data related to one set only, where we were able to see a good amount of neurotropic activity. The neurotropic action of varinostat we were able to see. If you look at, these are the control cells, and these are the cells treated with the nerve growth factor, and this is the cell which is treated with the varinostat only. So varinostat was able to induce significant amount of neurotropic activity and induce the neurite generation. When you combine both of them, you don't see any further induction of that. So these are the data presented quantitatively in terms of different measurable parameters, and the effect of varinostat either on neuritic length, or the number of neurite per cell, or the neurite length per cell. The effect of varinostat was comparatively significant, and it was comparable to nerve growth factor. So once we identified that, we just wanted to identify that how does really varinostat is inducing the neurotogeneric effect. But don't feel confused, don't be nervous looking at such a complex pathway. This pathway for the signal transduction for NGF is very complex. There are two different kind of pathways involved. So just to work on it, what we did is that, for the sake of ourselves, we simplified that how really to present that. So when NGF interacts with the neurotropic receptor, which is TRKA receptor, it induces two kind of pathways. One is mediated by RAS, which goes through MEK and ERK, and it leads to induced gene expression and neurite outgrowth and differentiation. But then there is another pathway which goes through PI3K and AKT-PKD, and this is the pathway which is responsible for neuroprotection effect of this neurotropin. So we also did, use some of the inhibitors of these as probe. These two inhibitors were used as a probe for this one, and this one inhibitor was used as a probe for PI3K to see what is really the mechanism of neuritogenesis induced by varinostat. What we found is that the inhibitors of MEK as well as PI3K, both of them, they completely abolish the presence, abolish the neurite outgrowth induced by varinostat. If you look at this one, these two inhibitors, this is without inhibitors, this is the with inhibitors, and you see they are comparable to control only. Then what we found is that the varinostat produces a time-dependent phosphorylation of ERK, and that's the reason that phosphorylation of ERK is responsible for neurotogenic effect of varinostat, and this could be attenuated in presence of the inhibitors of PI3K and MEK pathway. Also, since the TRKA is the site from where the NGF affects, what we found is that the TRKA receptor inhibitor also attenuated the neurotic outgrowth induced by varinostat. So this shows that the neurotogenic effect or the neurogenesis effect, which is being induced by varinostat, follows the pathway similar to the natural neurotropin nerve growth factor. We also confirmed that the activation of ERK produced by varinostat was inhibited with this inhibitor. This is the varinostat inducing the phosphorylation of ERK. This is the ERK1 and 2, which is the total amount, and this is the phosphorylated ERK, and you see the varinostat 1 and 2.5 micromolar. There is an induced phosphorylation which is completely suppressed in presence of the TRKA inhibitor. So we were able to confirm that attenuation of neurotogenetic effect of varinostat by this inhibitor is accompanied with the complete attenuation of phosphorylation of this particular gene. as varinostate is the inhibitor of histone deacetylase, we also confirm that the treatment of NS1 cells with varinostate induces the hyperacetylation of histone 3 and 4, and also it induces the hyperacetylation of tubulin. This is the control, and this is the varinostate, and we were able to see in 8 hours you see significant induction even up to the with the 1 micromolar, and even for the full 24-hour treatment you see significant hyperacetylation of tubulin. So acetylated tubulin is important for generation of neuroitogenetic effect. In the cell also we are able to see that when the NS1 cells are treated with varinostate, you see significant accumulation of acetylated tubulin compared to the control here. This is blue is the nucleus is stained with DAPI, and the green is the acetylated tubulin with the immunostaining. The NGF also was able to induce the acetylation of tubulin, but it was comparatively less prominent as compared to UC with the varinostate. Another thing we were able to show that the inhibitors of adenylate cyclase also induce the effect of varinostate on neuroitogenesis. So what we were able to show that varinostate induces the neurite outgrowth in NS1 cells, which is similar to nerve growth factor. Varinostate mediated neuritogenesis in NS1 cell happens via activation of MAP kinase pathway, and to some extent it goes through the PI3K pathway also, and that is the reason you see the neuroprotection. The varinostate induced neuritic outgrowth involves activation of ERK, and the phosphorylation of ERK is completely attenuated in presence of the MAP kinase inhibitor. And both varinostate induced neurite outgrowth and activation of ERK, they are abolished in presence of TRKA inhibitor, which is popularly known as neurotropin receptor. It induces the acetylation of histone HN3 and also tubulin, and the adenylate cyclase inhibitor further stimulated the neurotropic action of varinostate. Second set of inhibitors which we tested were some of the natural products, hormonal alkaloids, some of the cannabinoids, phenyl alcohol, and one of the compound which is a popular dietary supplement and popularly used as a herbal product was the berberine. Hormonal alkaloids, they are naturally occurring beta carbolines. They originally isolated from Pegasus. They are of interest for use in Amazonian, where they are also derived from other plants. One of the things is that they have shown broad spectrum of neuropharmacological actions, which includes psychoactive action, antidepressant activity, anxiolytic activity, hypnotic and anticonvulsant properties. The most important aspect of these is that they are very potent inhibitors of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, particularly the MAO-A. The inhibition of some of the kinases also has also been shown. So with this one, what we were able to show that among these all hormonal alkaloids, Harmine was the only one which were able to induce significant amount of neuritogenetic effect. But this was different what you see by varinostate. What is the difference? Harmine alone will not produce any effect on neuritogenesis, but you see the effect of Harmine only when it combines with the nerve growth factor. So this is the effect produced by nerve growth factor only, but it goes, there is a synergistic effect when the Harmine is included with the nerve growth factor. So the difference between the varinostate effect and the Harmine effect is different. Harmine is inducing the neurotropic effect of NGF, while varinostate itself has the neurotropic activity. So this is just the micrographic cellular representation of that, where we were able to show that the increasing concentration of Harmine was able to produce increase in the neuritic outgrowth, but alone, no. In presence of NGF, yes. This is the NGF alone. This is the NGF in presence of Harmine, and NGF in presence of higher concentration of Harmine. You clearly see the network of neuron which is going high. Then another set of analog which we tested was the cannabinoid analog, and they are commonly known as marijuana. They present in the marijuana variety of recreational, religious and medicinal purposes. They are terpenophenolic psychoactive constituents of cannabis. They have shown a broad spectrum of pharmacological effect and potential for treatment of chronic pain and disease. There are some recent reports which have emphasized the role of cannabinoid system, including cannabinoid receptor and endocannabinoids in neuroprotection and stimulation of neurogenesis. So with this, we screen the neurotropic and neurotogenic potential of cannabinoids, and what we found is that one of the cannabinoid, uh, canaflavin, was able to significantly induce the effect of NGF. Alone, you don't see much effect, but when canaflavin is present with the NGF, the difference is really clear here. This is the quantitative diagrammatic representation of different parameters here. Then third one which we tested was berberine. It's a broad spectrum of pharmacological activity. They have been shown with the berberine. It's an isoquinoline quaternary alkaloid. It's an important natural product for modern drug discovery and pharmacological research. It's a prominent constituent of several medicinal plants used in Indian and Chinese herbal medicines, and chemically standardized extracts containing berberine are now available as over-the-counter herbal remedy for different clinical. So people are already using as a dietary supplement or herbal remedy for different diseases. So recent study, they have shown the promising antidepressant actions of berberine. So that's the reason we tested that. And what we found is that even berberine alone does not show any effect, but berberine in presence of NGF causes significant induction of neurogenesis. We tested the action mechanism of action of neurotogenic effect of harmine. This is the phosphorylated ERK. This is in presence of NGF only. This is in presence of harmine only, and this is in presence of harmine and NGF. You see, there was a significant synergistic effect. But what is the difference here is that different time of treatment, NGF phosphorylation goes from here, goes high, but again it goes down. But one which is in presence of harmine, the phosphorylation still remains high. So harmine is producing a phosphorylation of ERK which sustained for the longer time compared to NGF alone, and probably that is the reason that it is producing the neurotropic effect. So considering that, now to conclude the session, we will try to review whatever we have discussed one by one. What are the technical consideration for phenotypic screening of neurodegenerative disease? First aspect is
no effect of harmine on PI3K pathway?
no.
Okay.
It's only the ERK.
Only the ERK.
Yes.
So that's the activation of ERK which leads to neurite growth.
Neurite outgrowth, yeah, that's true. We have not tested the neuroprotective effect of harmine. So, when it comes to the technical consideration for phenotypic screening for neurodegenerative diseases, we will just try to review one by one what are the important considerations. So, the most important one and one of the important one is the selection of compound libraries. And most of these considerations may be important particularly for neurodegenerative diseases, but they can be applied to any therapeutic area when it comes to selection of library. So there are various type of compound libraries. They have been chosen for phenotypic screening, which can include the set of marketed drugs which are already FDA approved, set of annotated compound libraries with the target information, natural product libraries, and libraries containing derivatives of known bioactive molecules. So all set of compounds they have been tested, but there is a general criteria for selection of compound libraries, such as enrichment of the compound with good physiological properties and structural diversity, and they are shared issues between target-based screen and the phenotypic screen. So this consideration, technical consideration, holds true for both phenotypic screen as well as you are testing the compound for target-based screen, that they have to be optimized for good physiochemical properties and structural diversity. Then additional consideration here is that for phenotypic screening, there are some additional consideration. Phenotypic screening generally has comparatively low throughput compared to target-based screen. So especially when the screens are conducted with primary cells in the tissues and small animal models, throughput is very low. So you have to be very careful in selection of the compounds and the compound libraries. So that with limited screening capacity, we need to be selective in quality of the compound set here. The compounds need to have a good solubility, membrane permeability, and display no cytotoxicity at the tested concentration. These are some of the important considerations. Another technical consideration here is that the models which we use for phenotypic screening, we discuss upon many models, but what are the technical consideration here is that, as I mentioned yesterday, the immortal cells can be scaled up easily and can also be engineered genetically to build up the reporter assay. But for neurodegenerative drug discovery, these immortalized cell lines may not be fully recapitulating the neuronal specific regulatory system, and they reflect similar susceptibility to interest. So that's the reason the primary neurons, maybe from rodents, which have the similar properties to human neurons, are limited by number of animals one can dissect from. So it can be a better source for cells for the phenotypic screen. Then different type of primary neurons could be prepared related to disease studies, such as cortical or hippocampal neurons for Alzheimer's disease, dopaminergic neurons for Parkinson's disease, and they allow the study of disease-specific neuronal phenotype. So you can select the neurons which are from the cortical or hippocampal region, particularly screening and using of those cell lines will be good enough for screening a compound for Alzheimer's disease, and some of the dopaminergic neurons will be good enough for screening a compound for Parkinson's disease. The glial cells and other kind of cells can also be introduced into primary cell cultures. Sometimes you have to go for with the combination cell cultures to model the interaction among the different cell types in nervous system. So this is one of the important consideration for model. Again, continuing on that, the human neurons differentiated from the embryonic stem cells or induce pluripotent stem cells, especially the IPCs derived from the disease patients. If we have some patient with the Alzheimer's or with the patient with the Parkinson's disease, if we are able to derive IPCs from them, they can offer a great potential in phenotypic screening. Then other technical consideration here are the assay methodologies. Assay methodologies which are applied in the phenotypic screen and what are the specific requirements for them. There are various fluorescent probes. They have been applied to detect the cellular events associated with the potential pathological mechanisms of ND, neurodegenerative diseases, which includes for mitochondrial dysfunction. They can be monitored by a lot of fluorescent dye which are commercially available nowadays, rhodamine or TMRM or TMRE or JC1 or MitoView. These are the dyes which can be used to monitor the mitochondrial function. Then for oxidative stress also there are a lot of fluorescent probes available, particularly dihydroethidium, Mitosox, DCFDA, different variants of DCFDA. They become fluorescent. These probes, they become fluorescent when they react with the specific superoxide or hydrogen peroxide or nitric oxide. There are different variants of DCFDA available. What happens when you load the cells with the DCFDA? The esterase in the cell, it cleaves it. And one of the important properties is that once it's cleaved by esterases, it remains inside the cell and it's not permeable and it will not come out. So whenever you are trying to monitor the generation of oxidative stress or specific superoxide in situ inside the cell, just expose them. You can monitor them kinetically in the flow cytometer. As the oxidative stress is generated, the level of fluorescence will go high. You can also monitor these cells by flow cytometry, or you can nowadays the high content analysis technologies are also coming up for that. The cell viability is very simple nowadays. There are a lot of approaches are available, but one of them which includes the double staining with the hex dye and the Yopro dye. So hex dye will stain the live cells only, and the Yopro will screen the damaged cells only, and you can monitor the cell viability. But there are more popular and simpler variations are either using MTT or XTT and also Alamar Blue. We mostly use Alamar Blue in our lab which monitors the metabolic activity of the viable cells. Another thing is that beside the probes, the green fluorescent proteins or luciferase reporters are useful tools to label these specific neurons. But the problem is that they may not be applicable to primary neuron cells because they have the limited efficiency for transfection, and there is a variation from batch to batch. So it becomes difficult. The reporter gene assays, they become difficult to develop, particularly for primary cells. But one alternative might be here is that you can develop the stably transfected embryonic cells, stem cells, or the induced pluripotent stem cells. Then they use them subsequently and differentiate them into neurons for screening. Although neuronal survival and the neuronal death is commonly used as an endpoint for phenotypic assay, but it may not truly reflect the neuronal dysfunction in neurodegenerative diseases. In the disease condition, the functional changes in the synapses and the structural changes in the neurites occur, which may be much earlier than the cell death. So the cell death occurs very late. So it's just important to identify some early biomarkers for onset of neuronal damage. So monitoring of these phenotypes in a dysfunctioning neurons will be valuable for identifying agents for early intervention of neurodegeneration. Continuing in that, now there are a lot of models which have been developed. Maybe every lab cannot afford them. High content screening methods are available now. These are the very expensive endeavors, but in many of the places these are available as core facilities. There are imaging technologies. They have been more widely applied to monitor neuron-specific changes such as neurite length, branching, and synapse formation. The approach which I showed, it was just a low throughput method. It can go to high throughput in the sense that we have already adopted it to 384 well plate, but it's not. There is no automation. You have to monitor the length of the neurite and all these things by manually tracing with the help of ImageJ. But now with the HCH high content screening approaches, they have developed the algorithms for monitoring of the, particularly for neuron specific changes and monitoring these parameters. The Cellnomics, they have come with the ArrayScan VTI platform, and there are some associated bio application algorithm from Thermo Fisher. They are used by for HCS platform. They have been specifically developed for measurement of neurite outgrowth and neuronal differentiation. So high content analysis also provides the opportunity to quantify the number of synapses using presynaptic markers in synapse staining. So by detecting various neuronal phenotype changes simultaneously, one of the advantages with HCS is that you can do some kind of multiplexing. So by detecting various neuronal phenotype changes simultaneously, high content screening is able to verify the most sensitive and robust phenotypes and uncover hits with the different mechanism of action. So if you have access to HCS system, this is the way to go. But if you don't have access to HCS system, use the system which I mentioned earlier. So compared with other technologies, the main advantage of HCS, as I mentioned, is the high level of multiplexing. You can do the simultaneous readout of several parameters together. So beside checking the main parameters, you can do some level of mechanistic studies also with the HCS. Superior spatial resolution are there, and detection changes in the subcellular level also can be monitored with the defined readout in HCS system. So our most current high content screening assays are still hampered by limited throughput, difficulties in automation, and algorithms which are developed convolute the images, which could be further improved at least through the application of models with easier readouts such as engineered fluorescent protein and reporters. There are still some limitations with HCS, but they are still much better than. Last but not the least, after going through all these challenges and what are the future perspectives which we can discuss, is that although it is obvious that among all the neurodegenerative diseases, neuronal dysfunction or neuronal death is the consistent phenotype, which is the disease progression, but it is, still it is unclear what is the real cause of this neurodegeneration is that. So understanding of that real cause will be important, and it's one of the important change here. In addition, it is reasonable to question whether the acute cellular neuronal death model accurately reflects the chronic progressive nature of the disease. Acute models and chronic models are there. So whatever we are monitoring in these in vitro systems, whether they will really truly reflect what is happening in the chronic models or not, that is one of the major challenge and the important point to be considered. So to mitigate the risk associated with these gaps, phenotypic selection should be guided by insights from human genetics, epidemiology, pathology, and clinical findings. So there will be every time there will be some new finding which can be incorporated into these phenotypic models. So in addition, to reduce the risk associated with the disease, irrelevance of a specific phenotype assay, compound with multiple mechanisms are preferred. So this is the reason that I was mentioning, or somebody was asking, that whether we can have the compound which can remove the toxin also, which can be a neuroprotective also, and which can induce the neurogenesis also. Those kind of multiple mechanism compounds and the leads will be important. So the compound with multiple mechanisms are preferred to one that modulate only a single phenotype. For example, a compound with both toxin removal and neuroprotection property may offer better disease modifying effect and potentially reduce the chance of false positive. This is one of the approach. After a successful phenotypic screening, to further develop the lead compounds, we need some translatable animal models. This is one of the area which is still under development. The available translatable models are not perfect, and the disease progression markers will be helpful for evaluating of these disease modifying efficacy. So I will stop here, and if there is any question, I will be pleased to answer. Sorry, I just thought that the material is too much, so I just went little fast. So I was expecting it to be finished by 12:30, but I finished 15 minutes earlier. So we have some time for the discussion, and if there is any question, I'll be pleased to answer. Yeah.
Inhibitors usually, one of the criteria that we consider is that they should be able to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Yes.
So, is there any way to check for that in these phenotypic screens, or?
Yeah, actually, normally when that is not the part of normal discovery, but yes, if you know that your ultimate drug compound that you are discovering, or the compound you are discovering, has to be for the treatment of disorders which are affecting the central nervous system, the permeability through blood-brain barrier has to be necessary, and there are some in vitro cell models where we can determine whether the compound is going to cross the blood-brain barrier or not. First day when I was discussing the pathways to drug discovery, I mentioned about ADME filters. So when your objective is to discover for CNS disorders, there is no additional filter which has to be added. But more commonly, that filter is added during the preclinical development or after the preclinical development, or maybe even during the preclinical development will be okay, because if you know that the compound is not really at a very prominent and potent efficacy in the pharmacological effect in vitro model or cell culture model, and if you are not seeing that translating into an animal model, one of the reason might be that your compound is not crossing the blood-brain barrier. So during that time only, when you are working on optimization of ADME properties, this will be one of the properties which you have to work on. And there are some well-established models available for that, cell culture models, where you try to see whether compound will be permeable to blood-brain barrier or not.
So are you planning to test further these compounds in animal models?
Yes, we have already talked to some people. We don't have animal model in house. We have collaborators in some medical center. They have models for dementia. They have models for other neurological disorders, and we have already talked to them about hormonal alkaloid, Harmine, and also berberine. In case of varinostat, this is one of the reports which we have recently made. That paper has been accepted in the molecular and cellular neurosciences, and some people have already shown some interest. Varinostat is already in clinical use for a particular kind of cancer, so that is one of the area we would like to work in future.
So it says varinostat is it is used in cancer treatment, right?
Yeah. Most of the HDAC inhibitors are there, but now what we are trying to see is that varinostat is a pan-HDAC inhibitor. So one of the important thing will be if it is tubular acetylation. Tubular acetylation also is induced by HDAC6 and HDAC8. So we are trying to see whether any we tested HDAC6 and HDAC8 inhibitors, but their activity in the neurogenesis assay was not very prominent. Maybe some other factors are involved. So we are just trying to get access to some additional isoform selective inhibitors, because more selective isoform selective inhibitor is more other off-target effects will be there. But this is one of the lead which we have generated that yes, the HDAC inhibitor can have a potential neurotropic activity which is similar to narcolepsy.
So are you looking on some other pathway or only the ERK or EIP? Because
We are interrogating other pathways also. Specifically, one of the things which we observed, if you remember from the last slide which I presented in our data, is that normally these mechanisms they seem to be complex. We were expecting that the adenylate cyclase inhibitors will attenuate the neurotropic activity of varinostat. But what we found is that it was not attenuating, it was rather inducing the neurotropic activity. So it means there are some additional pathways which are also important, and we are trying to look into. But which in particular, specifically, how really cyclic AMP is able to induce this neurogenesis, that will be an important part.
and what are the genes which are directly in contact with varinostat? Like where does it end?
Normally, varinostat in case of cancer produces a general transcription because it's a pan-HDAC inhibitor, it's inhibited all kinds of HDAC. So the overall it produces the general preparation in the transcription. But there are some specific, a lot of other off-target effects have also been shown, which I am not very much familiar with, but this is one of its implications. So I am still debating on my part. So tomorrow, instead of going to the module 1 again, I would like to discuss the application of phenotypic assay particularly for neglected